Hello, everyone. This is my presentation on fallacies and thank you for smoking by me, Hans Schardinger. My thesis statement for this essay is in this essay, I will go over the multiple fallacies of Nick's arguments in the novel and explain how they are used incorrectly. Aside from Nick, I will go over Lauren Lutch's examples of fallacies as well. So basically, my thesis statement is about how I will go over each of the fallacies that Nick and Lauren Lutch present. So in my essay, I addressed 7 fallacies, and those fallacies were red herring, fault analogy, non sequitur, stacking the deck, bandwagon appeal, scare tactic, and overly sentimental appeal. So, red herring is an argument that changes the subject abruptly to throw the audience off trail. Fault analogy is a comparison between two objects or concepts that is inaccurate or inconsequential. Non sequitur is a fallacy with claims, reasons, and warrants that fail to connect logically. Then stacking the deck is when the person arguing tries to prove a point by focusing only on one side of the argument while ignoring the other. Now, bandwagon appeal is when a course of action is recommended and becomes a norm because everyone else is doing it. Then, scare tactic presents an issue in terms of exaggerated threat or danger. Then, lastly, overly sentimental appeal is when a person uses heartwarming or heart wrenching appeals to emotion so that they can win support. Now I will talk about my main body points and how they support my thesis. So, my first body point was about how Nick goes on the Oprah show to defend tobacco. And this scene is an example of a red herring fallacy. The second one is when Nick goes on Nightline with Ted Koppel. This one is actually 3 different fallacies. First one is fault analogy, second is non sequitur, and then the third one is stacking the deck. And there's 2 quotes for this scene. And then the third one is Nick has dinner with Heather Holloway, and this was an example of a bandwagon appeal. Then the fourth one is Nick visits Lauren Lutch to give him hush money. And there's 2 fallacies for this scene, and the first one is scare tactic, and the second one is overly sentimental appeal. Now, all these main body points support my thesis as each scene provides multiple fallacies or one fallacy presented by Nick and Lauren Lutch. Now I will go over the quotes from the book and how they support the main points or fallacies. So the first quote is on the Oprah show where Nick says, "If I may say so, Oprah, that is the typical of the attitude of the federal government. We know how you feel. It's this same attitude that brought us prohibition, Vietnam, and 50 years of living on the brink of nuclear destruction." And this quote is an example of red herring fallacy. The second quote is Ted. 20 years ago, the scientists were telling us that we're all going to die of artificial sweeteners. Now they're telling us we goofed. Never mind. This quote is an example of faulty analogy or non sequitur. Now, the third quote is, "But the irony in all this, Ted, is that the real demonstrated #1 killer in America is cholesterol. And here comes Senator Finister, whose fine and beautiful state is, I regret to have to say, clogging the nation's arteries with Vermont cheddar cheese." This quote is an example of stacking the deck. Next, 99% of the everything that is done in the world, good and bad, is done to pay the mortgage. This quote is an example of bandwagon appeal. Next quote, "Don't move or I'll blow a hole the size of a grapefruit in you." This quote is an example of scare tactic. Then the last quote, "You know a song by George Jones, Hell Stays Open All Night Long? I listen to it over and over." This quote is an example of overly sentimental appeal. Now I will go over how each of the quotes support each fallacy. So, the first one, this scene in the book presents a red herring fallacy since Nick abruptly brings up prohibition and nuclear destruction out of nowhere after making a brief joke about smoking. He throws the audience off trail by changing the subject and focusing the subject on prohibition and nuclear war. The second one, faulty analogy. This scene is a good example of faulty analogy because of how different sugar and tobacco are in terms of how they affect your overall health. To compare artificial sweeteners to tobacco is an unfair comparison since one is obviously more damaging than the other. And then the third one, this scene is an example of non sequitur as well. This is because Nick claims that because one scientific study was wrong, we must be skeptical of all scientific studies. The error in the artificial sweetener study has nothing to do with how accurate or inaccurate the studies of tobacco are. This is non sequitur since his claim and reasoning fails to connect logically. Now to the third one, stacking the deck. In this scene, Nick avoids the questions about how harmful tobacco can be. Instead, he attacks Senator Finister by focusing on how Vermont clogs the nation's arteries with their cheddar cheese. This is stacking the deck against the senator since Nick focuses only on one side of the argument. Then the next one, bandwagon appeal. This quote is a good example of bandwagon appeal since Nick tries to convince Heather that he is no different from the other people in what he does for a living. He tries to argue that the reason he does his job is the same as others, as everyone is also trying to pay a mortgage. Then the next one, scare tactic. This scene shows Lauren Lutz using a scare tactic against Nick. He threatens Nick that he will shoot a hole in him the size of a grapefruit. This is a scare tactic since he uses the words the size of a grapefruit to exaggerate the danger or the threat. Then the last one, overly sentimental appeal. This scene is an example of overly sentimental appeal since Lauren Lutz uses this song to describe how depressed he has been lately to the point where he feels like he is in hell all the time. He uses this song to convince Nick how the tobacco industries have torn down his life. That is my presentation on my essay for fallacies and thank you for smoking. And thank you for watching.